Every life tells a story. Join Frank Julian as he shares his one chapter at a time from Story of a Soul 2, releasing every Wednesday.
The Story of a Soul 2 by Frank Julian with Sean O'Neill, narrated by Frank Julian. Chapter 31, God Sways the Vote. The next storm to blow in came out of nowhere and hit my blind side. There were accusations made about the senior pastor at our church, my friend of 20 years. I did not believe them at first, and then I simply refused to believe them. I will not get into what the accusations were about, but I will share with you the cataclysmic change that occurred in my life as a result. God is with me and has given me a peace that passes all understanding, as long as I have done things His way. He told me not to enter the fight leaning on my own understanding, but to trust in Him. As long as I did that, I had peace. If I tried to defend myself against false accusations, it got messy. Accusations were flying from many different directions. One was below the belt, namely that I had known about everything that was going on and had approved of it. In fact, I knew nothing. I was just as shocked and dismayed as the other church members were. When the church overseer came and only made things worse, I just kept my mouth shut. At that point, I did not try to defend myself. Of course, his position was to let the previous pastor to return. I said that I would leave and never be under him again. I resigned as the first pastor, and we planned on leaving. Then I got a call from the deacons of the church asking me to be the acting senior pastor until a new one could be voted on. I agreed. We had decided that the new election would be in October. As the weeks passed by, there seemed to be growing support among many in the church, including deacons, for the notion that I could become the permanent senior pastor. I needed 2/3 of the membership to vote for me in order to be given the position. I told them that if I was not elected, I would step aside by leaving, and that this course of events would be perfectly fine with me. Deep in my heart, I knew that God had prepared me for this role all my life. I was a healer, and this church needed healing. It was broken spiritually, financially, and relationally. There's a story in the Bible that tells of Abraham sacrificing the ram from the bush instead of his son, Isaac. I believe that in this situation, I was the ram in the bush to be used by the Lord as a living sacrifice. From July until October, I was the acting senior pastor. Everything appeared to me to be going quite well, given the terrible shock that the entire church community had gone through as I took up the role of leadership. I will tell you flatly, though, that on the night of the vote, October 17, 2010, I felt positively terrible. It was one of the worst nights of my life. People whom I considered friends were actively campaigning against me. Frankly, I had no clue how the vote would turn out. I did not know who was for me or who was against me. Deep down, however, I had peace. I knew that the Lord was for me. I had not offended Him, and I had forgiven all of the things said against me falsely. My wife and I sat in the front row, and the people who were voting passed by us after they had cast their vote. It was a very strange experience. I will admit to not liking other people choosing the path of my life. I tried in the preceding 3 months to just minister and to love the people within the church unconditionally. I wish it were that simple. I know that I did not do everything right, but I tried. I have asked people to forgive me if I offended them. I've asked the Lord to let me experience as much of the Word of God as possible. When I received the kiss of betrayal, like Judas gave Jesus in the garden, I cringed. I felt like saying, "You are betraying me with a kiss?" I didn't say anything, though. I prayed for them so that I could remain free. I knew that I was supposed to stay if they voted for me. I did the strangest thing. I went to see a friend and his wife from high school. I knew that they were in town from Florida. They knew that I was a minister now, but they had known me back when I ran for president of my class. In some ways, I felt like I was running for class officer again. They looked at me and said, "Of course you're going to win, and you'll do a great job." I looked at them and I said, "Really?" I went to them because everyone else in my life was too connected to this mess. My best friend had died 2 months earlier, unexpectedly from cardiac complications due to diabetes at his daughter's high school play. My wife was there because he was her brother George. He lived in Kalamazoo before his untimely death. He had been my best man, and we had a spiritual brotherhood built up over the years. I couldn't go to George any longer. I remember that we went to Kalamazoo the day after his death. I went with my 2 adult children. It was a house of mourning. It was filled with shock and grief. When their minister arrived, I felt a joy in my soul. I wanted to talk to him. The Lord spoke to my heart. That's what people feel when you arrive in the midst of their crisis. I have pondered that ever since. Thankfully, before the death of George and the church upheaval, the idea came to me to build a chapel in my backyard. I thought that perhaps I was losing my marbles. Who has a chapel in their backyard? I talked to Phil at church, and he laid the foundation perfectly. It has never flooded. I bought a shed from the Home Depot, and my son and I put it together. My wife bought a pew at an estate sale. I bought other items, and it came together beautifully. I would go in there to pray and take communion. It didn't matter what else was going on in the world. Whenever I went in there to pray and read the Bible, I'd come out refreshed. When I was upset, my wife would say, "Go to your shed." It kind of felt like go to your doghouse, but I knew what she meant. I would go and come out new. It never failed. The Lord sustained me through it all. On top of the betrayal of that fateful night of the church's vote, and the fact that people chose to leave in the aftermath, there was all the debt left for me to deal with. It was over $2 million, and the balloon was coming due in 2 years. I gave that one to the Lord. I told him, "This one is yours." I'm sure that he laughed up in heaven. It says in Psalm 2, he sits in the heaven and laughs. Right at this time, a guy from the church, Ken, came to me and said, "I believe the Lord told me to tell you to write this book. You and Peggy should be a priest and nun who love each other but never marry. They are split up from the church. He goes to Africa to start Fawn." I thought he was crazy. I said, who is going to read a book that I write and yet support Fawn? In the end, it proved to be a good diversion while all that mess was going on in the church. I would get the chapters in a vision, not an open vision, but imaginations in my mind. I would then come home and write the next chapter. I would often say, they're going to make a movie out of this book because I'm getting it in scenes. I guess that God knows what we need when we go through trials. Writing the book was my escape. I had no idea what would come of it. Only God knew. I like it that way. The book was self-published, and it was scheduled to come out right around the time of the vote. As I sat there waiting for the vote and the decision of the people in the church, I remember thinking that maybe God would use the book to give another purpose to my life instead of the pastoral work that I had been called to do. Finally, the deacons entered the sanctuary where all the people were sitting in anxious suspense. There we sat like it was open season on the Julians. Then they announced the results. I had been voted in by 2/3 margin to be the senior pastor. People began to congratulate me. I looked at the disgruntled people in the back, knowing they did not like this result. I believe that God had his way. He had moved heaven and earth to put me in this position. I promised him that I would do my best and that I would never quit. Those promises would eventually be challenged. The first thing that I did was to present my vision for the future of the church. I knew immediately that the basis of that vision was Isaiah 58. I was to repair the breach and raise the foundation of the streets that were broken. They were broken everywhere. We would care for the poor and oppressed, and God would make us like a well-watered garden. I had a picture put in my office of Daniel in the lion's den. When the stream of people came to my office each week telling me they were leaving the church, I would look at that picture and just trust in the Lord. Fewer people attending regularly meant less money coming in, and the bank officials would periodically meet with me and tell me that they were going to put all of our stuff out on the street. I would trust in God. All I could think was that the only thing that matters is that there remain a thriving faith Christian assembly wherever it may meet, regardless of the size of the congregation. I knew that I had to guard my heart. I wouldn't let anyone offend me. One person leaving the church said, "Aren't you going to beg us to stay?" I said, "If I did, would you?" She said, "No." And I said, "Then I won't beg." When a big tithe and offering giver wanted to manipulate me because of a strong dislike for the color of the curtains in the sanctuary, I begged, but that individual still left. I could only rely on God. He is more than enough. The one thing I learned was that he wanted me to see his invisible hand, like I had with Fawn. I knew that Fawn was born of God and would overcome any obstacle. I knew this church, started by Italian immigrants in 1942, would overcome every attack of Satan only with God's help. I believe that the prayers prayed in 1942 were time capsules that would be released in 2012. One of the most difficult things for me to do was leave the Italian Pentecostal denomination. I loved them and had been with them for 20 years. But when the leadership turned on me, I had no choice. I proceeded to seek the Lord for guidance. One of the pastors recommended the International Pentecostal Holiness Church. At first, the name scared me. As I learned about them and the modern reforms they had made, I felt more comfortable. I met with the bishop over our area. Bishop Brad did everything to help us make the switch, and I'm eternally grateful. He and the IPHC network were so supportive of the church and me during this time of transition. I never knew how important they would be to me. Only God knew. He wanted me to live by faith. Comerica, our lending bank, wanted their $2 million. We negotiated with them and prayed a lot, especially in my backyard shed chapel. I finally called it a chapel as things began to fall in place. Comerica agreed to forgive us half of the debt if we could get the other $1 million as a mortgage from someone else. Every bank and lending institution turned us down. Our deadline of April 1st was quickly approaching. I laid my head down on my pillow and said, Lord, immediately in my spirit I heard, call Bishop Brad.
Thank you for listening. Join Frank Julian every Wednesday for a new chapter of Story of a Soul 2. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.